Your mind feels like a battlefield between conflicting thoughts and emotions you can't seem to control. Every day you're pulled between who you think you should be and darker impulses you'd rather ignore, while anxiety clouds your ability to find peace or direction. I am Carl Jung, the depth psychologist who spent decades mapping the hidden territories of the human psyche, and discovered that chaos is actually the raw material of psychological wholeness. What I learned about order and chaos will transform how you understand your mind, giving you the keys to integrate your shadows into an authentic, unified self. But first, like this video, subscribe for more psychological wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to explore the depths of consciousness. I was born in 1875 in the small Swiss village of Kesswil, where the Rhine flows toward Lake Constance. My childhood was marked by an unusual sensitivity to the invisible world that most adults seemed to ignore. There was a particular stone in our garden, a simple grey limestone, that became my closest companion during those formative years. To others, it was merely a rock, but to me, it was alive with possibility and meaning. I would sit with this stone for hours, creating elaborate conversations and scenarios. Sometimes I was the stone, sometimes I was the boy who cared for it. This early relationship taught me something profound about the nature of consciousness, that we are never truly alone because we carry within us multiple perspectives, multiple voices, multiple ways of being. My father was a rural pastor, a man caught between faith and doubt, and my mother struggled with what we would now recognize as severe depression and psychotic episodes. She would often speak of spirits and presences that visited her at night. While my father dismissed these as illness, I felt drawn to understand what she was experiencing. There was something in her visions that felt more real than the ordinary world around us. These early experiences with my mother's otherworldly encounters planted the first seeds of my later understanding that what we call madness might actually be the psyche's attempt to communicate truths that conscious mind cannot accept. Her suffering became my first laboratory for exploring the depths of human consciousness. During my university years studying medicine, I was drawn to psychiatry, though it was considered the least prestigious field at the time. My colleagues couldn't understand why I would choose to work with the mentally ill when I could have pursued surgery or internal medicine, but I felt called to understand the mysteries of the mind that had surrounded me since childhood. My early work at the Bergholzli Hospital brought me face to face with patients whose inner worlds were rich with symbolism and meaning, even in their apparent chaos. I began to see patterns in their delusions, recurring themes that seemed to connect them to something larger than their individual suffering. This was my first glimpse into what I would later call the collective unconscious shared psychological inheritance that binds all humanity together. It was during this period that I developed the word association test, a simple technique that revealed the hidden complexes governing our behavior. When patients hesitated before certain words or showed physical reactions, I knew I had stumbled upon psychological material that operated outside conscious control. These autonomous complexes, as I came to understand them, were like separate personalities living within the psyche, each with their own agenda and emotional charge. The stone from my childhood taught me that consciousness is not singular but multiple, not simple but layered with meaning and possibility. This early insight would guide everything I discovered about the human mind in the decades that followed. In my later years, I built a tower at Bollingen with my own hands, stone by stone, level by level. This tower became a physical representation of how I understood the psyche to be constructed. Just as the tower had a foundation, walls, and various rooms serving different purposes, the human mind has distinct levels and chambers, each serving essential functions in our psychological life. The conscious mind, where you experience your daily thoughts and decisions, represents only the uppermost floor of this psychological tower, It is here that you deliberate, plan, and maintain your sense of identity. But consciousness, for all its apparent importance, is actually the smallest part of your total psychological reality. Like the visible portion of an iceberg, it floats upon vast depths of unconscious material. Directly beneath consciousness lies what I call the personal unconscious, a repository of your forgotten memories, repressed experiences, and overlooked impressions. This level contains everything that once was conscious, but has been pushed below the threshold of awareness. Perhaps you remember arguing with a friend years ago, but you've forgotten the feelings of shame and hurt that accompanied that experience. Those emotions don't disappear. They sink into the personal unconscious, where they continue to influence your behavior in subtle ways. I discovered this layer through my work with patients who would suddenly recall traumatic events they had completely forgotten. A woman who feared water remembered nearly drowning as a child. A man who couldn't maintain relationships discovered a pattern of abandonment stretching back to his earliest years. The personal unconscious holds our individual psychological history, both painful and pleasant, shaping who we are from the shadows. But beneath even this personal layer lies something far more profound, the collective unconscious, a level of the psyche shared by all humanity. This deepest foundation contains what I call archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that have existed since our species began to develop consciousness. The mother, the hero, the wise old man, the shadow. These are not merely concepts, but living, psychological forces that shape how we understand ourselves and our world. When I built my tower at Bollingen, I carved symbols and inscriptions that came to me without conscious planning. My hands seemed to know what to create, guided by something deeper than personal preference. This was the collective unconscious expressing itself through my individual creativity, connecting me to the artistic and symbolic traditions of countless generations. The architecture of your psyche is not static but dynamic, with constant communication flowing between levels. Dreams serve as messengers, carrying information from the unconscious to consciousness. Emotions provide signals about what requires attention. Fantasies and imaginative experiences offer glimpses into the deeper layers of psychological reality. Understanding this architecture changes everything about how you relate to your inner life. When you feel conflicted or confused, you're experiencing the different levels of your psyche attempting to communicate with each other. The anxiety you feel might be consciousness receiving a warning from the personal unconscious about unresolved trauma. The sudden inspiration that solves a problem might be an archetypal pattern from the collective unconscious offering its wisdom. My tower at Bollingen stands as a reminder that psychological wholeness requires acknowledging and integrating all levels of the psyche, from the conscious ego to the deepest archetypal foundations of human experience. During my most difficult psychological period, a figure appeared in my active imagination that I came to call Philemon. He was an old man with the wings of a kingfisher and the horns of a bull, carrying 4 keys in his hand. Philemon taught me about the shadow, the part of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge, the dark twin that follows us everywhere but remains hidden from our conscious view. I remember the first time I truly encountered my own shadow. I was in my late 30s, successful in my career, respected by my colleagues, yet increasingly troubled by thoughts and impulses that seemed foreign to my civilized self. There were moments of rage that surprised me with their intensity, sexual fantasies that contradicted my moral beliefs, and a ruthless ambition that I had never admitted to myself. Philemon showed me that these unwanted aspects of my personality were not enemies to be destroyed, but parts of myself that had been banished to the unconscious. Every time we say, "I would never do that," or "I'm not that kind of person," we create shadow material. The shadow contains not only our individual rejected qualities, but also the collective shadow of our cultural, the traits and behaviors that society deems unacceptable. The tragedy of the shadow is that in our attempt to be good, we often become weak. By refusing to acknowledge our capacity for darkness, we lose access to vital energy and authentic power. The shadow contains not only our destructive impulses, but also our undeveloped potential, our creative wildness, our passionate intensity. When we reject the shadow, we reject life itself. I learned this lesson painfully during my confrontation with the unconscious. For months, I felt as though I was losing my mind, overwhelmed by fantasies and visions that seemed to emerge from some primitive depth. But Philemon taught me to dialogue with these dark forces rather than fight them. He showed me that integration, not elimination, was the path to psychological wholeness. The shadow reveals itself in many ways. Notice what irritates you most about other people. These qualities are often projections of your own unacknowledged shadow material. The colleague whose arrogance infuriates you may be reflecting your own hidden narcissism. The friend whose laziness frustrates you might be showing you the part of yourself that wants to rest and receive rather than constantly achieve and give dreams. Frequently present shadow figures, the criminal, the prostitute, the fool, the savage. These dream characters are not threats, but teachers, offering to show you the parts of yourself that consciousness has rejected. When you dream of being chased by a dark figure, try turning around and asking what this shadow wants to give you, rather than running away in fear. The integration of the shadow is not about becoming evil or acting out destructive impulses. It's about acknowledging these forces within yourself so that you can make conscious choices about how to channel their energy. The rage in your shadow might become righteous anger that motivates you to fight injustice. The greed in your shadow might become healthy ambition that drives you towards success. The sexuality in your shadow might become passionate creativity that infuses all your work with life. Philemon taught me that the shadow is actually our greatest teacher because it shows us what we need to become whole. The qualities we most despise in ourselves are often the very qualities that, when integrated consciously, become our greatest strengths. The shadow is not our enemy but our unlived life, waiting to be claimed and transformed into conscious power. Throughout my career, I wore many masks. As a young doctor, I cultivated the persona of the serious medical professional, rational, always in control. As a researcher, I presented myself as the objective scientist, carefully distancing my personal experiences from my theoretical work. As a lecturer, I adopted the persona of the wise professor, speaking with authority about the mysteries of the human psyche. These personas were not deceptions, but necessary adaptations to the social roles I needed to fulfill. The persona is like a mask or costume that allows us to function effectively in different contexts. Just as actors wear different costumes for different roles, we develop different personas for different aspects of our lives: the parent, the professional, the friend, the lover. The challenge arises when we begin to believe that these masks are our true identity. I witnessed this confusion countless times in my practice. A businessman who had spent 30 years presenting himself as aggressive and competitive came to me when he could no longer access his gentler, more sensitive nature. A woman who had perfected the persona of the nurturing mother found herself unable to express her own needs and desires. They had become so identified with their social roles that they had lost touch with their authentic selves. The persona becomes problematic when it completely covers our genuine personality. Like a mask that has grown so tight we can no longer remove it. I remember periods in my own life when I felt exhausted by the constant performance required to maintain my professional image. The energy required to present myself as the composed psychiatrist while internally struggling with my own psychological turmoil was enormous. This persona inflation leads to a peculiar form of suffering, the sense that you are living someone else's life. You may be successful by external standards, yet feel hollow and disconnected from your own experience. The persona that once served you becomes a prison, limiting your ability to respond authentically to life's challenges and opportunities. Learned to recognize the signs of excessive persona identification in myself and my patients. When someone says I have to or I should constantly, they are often speaking from persona rather than authentic choice. When someone feels completely different at work versus at home, there may be too great a split between their social mask and their genuine nature. When someone feels exhausted by social interaction rather than energized by authentic connection, the persona has likely become too rigid and demanding. The goal is not to eliminate the persona, but to develop a healthy relationship with it. Just as I learned to consciously choose which professional mask to wear in different contexts, you can learn to put on and take off your social roles with awareness. The key is maintaining conscious contact with who you are beneath the mask. I found it helpful to create private time and space where no persona was required, time alone in nature, creative activities that had no professional purpose, relationships where I could express my uncertainties and vulnerabilities. These persona-free zones allowed me to remain connected to my authentic self while still functioning effectively in social and professional contexts. The persona becomes healthy when it serves your genuine purposes rather than controlling your entire identity. You can be professional when professionalism is required, playful when play is appropriate, serious when gravity is needed, without losing touch with the underlying continuity of your being. The mask becomes a tool for authentic expression rather than a substitute for genuine identity. During my darkest psychological crisis, when I felt most disconnected from the world of rational thought and professional success, a feminine figure began appearing in my paintings and active imagination. She was sometimes a young maiden, sometimes a wise woman, sometimes a mysterious guide leading me through landscapes of the unconscious. I came to understand her as my animatha, feminine aspect of my masculine psyche. This inner feminine figure taught me about receptivity, intuition, and the value of feeling over thinking. She showed me that my overdeveloped masculine consciousness, with its emphasis on logic, control, and achievement, had cut me off from essential aspects of psychological life. The anima guided me toward a more complete understanding of what it means to be human, beyond the limitations of gender identity. Every man carries within him an anima, just as every woman carries an animist, the masculine principle within her feminine consciousness. These contrasexual elements are not mere psychological curiosities, but essential components of psychological wholeness. They represent the unlived potentials of our opposite gender, offering qualities and perspectives that our conscious identity typically excludes. I painted many images of my anima during this period, trying to capture her ever-changing nature. Sometimes she appeared as a fierce goddess demanding recognition, sometimes as a gentle muse offering inspiration, sometimes as a critical voice pointing out the limitations of my rational approach to life. Through these artistic expressions, I began to understand that the anima is not a single figure, but a complex psychological function that mediates between consciousness and the unconscious. The anima often appears first through projection onto women in our outer lives. A man may find himself intensely attracted to a woman who seems to embody mystery, creativity, or emotional depth qualities he has not developed in himself. This projection serves an important psychological function, drawing his attention to aspects of himself that need development. But problems arise when the projection is not eventually withdrawn and integrated. I observed this pattern repeatedly, in my patients and in my own life. A man who projects his anima onto his wife expects her to carry all the emotional and intuitive functions in the relationship, leaving him cut off from his own feelings. A woman who projects her animus onto her husband expects him to handle all decisions and intellectual challenges, leaving her disconnected from her own thinking capacity. The animus in women often appears as a collection of opinions, judgments, and ideas that seem to come from outside her own experience. A woman might find herself arguing positions she doesn't really believe, or feeling driven by ambitions that don't reflect her genuine values. The animus can manifest as an inner critic that undermines her confidence, or as a driving force that pushes her toward achievements that don't satisfy her deeper nature. Integration of the anima, or animus, requires recognizing these figures as aspects of our own psyche, rather than projecting them onto others. When I learned to dialogue with my anima directly through active imagination and creative expression, I no longer needed to seek these qualities exclusively through relationships with women. I could access my own capacity for receptivity, intuition, and emotional depth. This integration transforms relationships from needy projections into genuine encounters between whole human beings. When you develop your own contrasexual qualities, you can appreciate these qualities in others without desperately needing them to complete you. Love becomes a choice rather than a compulsion, based on genuine affinity rather than psychological necessity. The anima and animus also serve as bridges to the collective unconscious, connecting us to the eternal feminine and masculine principles that have guided human development throughout history. They carry the wisdom of countless generations about how to balance receptivity with activity, feeling with thinking, being with doing. For over 40 years, I kept detailed journals of my dreams, accumulating thousands of records that became my most valuable research material. These dream journals revealed patterns and themes that consciousness alone could never have discovered. Through studying my own dreams alongside those of my patients, I came to understand that dreams are not random neural firing, but meaningful communications from the unconscious mind. One dream from my youth particularly shaped my understanding of the psyche's deeper layers. I found myself in a house that I knew was my house, though it looked nothing like any place I had ever lived. I began exploring, discovering floor after floor, descending deeper into the earth. The uppermost floors were furnished in a style I recognized, but as I descended, the rooms became more primitive, older, until finally I reached a cave-like basement filled with ancient pottery and human skulls. This dream became a template for understanding the structure of consciousness itself. Upper floors representing personal consciousness, the lower levels revealing increasingly ancient layers of human psychological development. The dream was showing me that beneath our modern civilized consciousness lie older ways of being that still influence our behavior and experience. Dreams serve a compensatory function, bringing to consciousness what has been neglected or repressed during waking life. If you spend your days being rational and controlled, your dreams might flood you with emotion and chaos. If you focus exclusively on work and achievement, your dreams might present images of play, relationships, or spiritual seeking. The unconscious is always attempting to balance consciousness, providing what is missing from your one-sided conscious attitude. I learned to pay particular attention to recurring dreams and dream symbols. A patient who repeatedly dreamed of water flooding. Her house was being warned by her unconscious about emotions she was refusing to acknowledge. A man who dreamed of being chased by wild animals was encountering the instinctual forces he had repressed in his overly intellectual approach to life. The unconscious speaks in the language of symbols, using images that carry emotional and intuitive meaning rather than literal information. Dream interpretation requires understanding the personal associations of the dreamer rather than applying universal symbolic meanings. When I worked with patients, I always asked what each dream symbol meant to them personally before considering archetypal interpretations. A snake in a dream might represent healing for one person, sexuality for another, or wisdom for a third, depending on their individual relationship to snake symbolism. The technique I developed involved approaching dreams as if they were letters. from a friend communications requiring attention and response rather than problems to be solved. I would ask myself and my patients, what is this dream trying to tell me? What aspect of my life does it illuminate? How does it challenge my current understanding of my situation? Some dreams clearly originated from the personal unconscious, processing recent experiences and unresolved conflicts, but other dreams seemed to tap into deeper, collective layers of the psyche, presenting archetypal figures and themes that connected the individual dreamer to universal human experiences. These big dreams, as I came to call them, often occurred at significant life transitions and carried numinous power that could guide major life decisions. I discovered that keeping a dream journal creates a dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious. When you record your dreams regularly and reflect on their meanings, the unconscious begins to communicate more clearly and frequently. The psyche seems to respond to conscious attention by becoming more willing to share its wisdom. Dreams also revealed the prospective function of the unconscious's ability to point toward future psychological development. A dream might show you capabilities you haven't yet developed, or warn you about directions that would lead to psychological difficulty. Learning to work with dreams became one of the most practical tools I could offer for psychological growth and decision-making. When my psychological crisis reached its deepest point, traditional methods of understanding failed me. Neither rational analysis nor medical training could help me navigate the flood of fantasies and visions that overwhelmed my consciousness. In desperation, I developed a technique that I later called active imagination, a method of consciously engaging with unconscious contents while remaining awake and aware. I began by allowing my mind to settle into a state between waking and sleeping, where images could arise spontaneously without being immediately censored by rational thought. At first, the material that emerged was chaotic and frightening dark figures, threatening landscapes, scenarios that seemed to pull me toward madness. But gradually, I learned to participate in these fantasies as an observer and participant, rather than a passive victim. My written records from this period reveal conversations with figures who seemed to possess their own intelligence and autonomy. Philemon, the wise old man with kingfisher wings, became my primary guide through these inner territories. He would answer my questions, challenge my assumptions, and offer perspectives that I could never have generated through conscious thought alone. These dialogues felt as real and meaningful as conversations with any external person. The key to active imagination is maintaining what I call the transcendent function, the ability to hold conscious awareness while allowing unconscious contents to emerge and express themselves. This requires a delicate balance. Too much conscious control, and nothing genuinely new can arise. Too little conscious participation, and you risk being overwhelmed by unconscious material or slipping into passive fantasy. I discovered that creative expression often facilitated this process. Painting, sculpture, writing, or movement could provide channels for unconscious contents to manifest in tangible form. My stone carvings at Bollingen, my paintings of mandalas and mythological figures, my written fantasies all served as bridges between the conscious and unconscious realms. Active imagination differs fundamentally from ordinary daydreaming or fantasy. In passive fantasy, you impose your conscious wishes and fears onto the imaginal material. In active imagination, you allow the unconscious to present its own content and then engage with that material as if it were independently real. You might find yourself arguing with a dream figure, asking questions of an inner wise woman, or negotiating with a hostile presence. The technique proved invaluable not only for my own psychological development, but as a therapeutic tool with patients. A woman struggling with depression might dialogue with the dark, heavy presence she felt inside her chest. A man battling anger might converse with the raging beast that appeared in his imagination. Rather than fighting these psychological forces, active imagination allows for relationship and eventual integration. Safety in active imagination comes from maintaining what I call the observer ego, a part of consciousness that remains aware of the difference between inner experience and outer reality. You participate fully in the imaginal encounter while knowing that you are engaging with psychological material rather than external entities. This conscious framework prevents the technique from becoming pathological. The material that emerges through active imagination often contains surprising wisdom and solutions to life problems. I frequently found that my inner figures knew things that my conscious mind had not yet discovered. They might point out blind spots in my thinking, suggest creative approaches to challenges, or reveal emotional truths I had been avoiding. Regular practice of active imagination creates an ongoing dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious, reducing the likelihood of being overwhelmed by psychological material that has no outlet for expression. When the unconscious has a voice through this technique, it becomes an ally in psychological development rather than a source of symptoms and disruption. My early research at the Bergholzli Hospital involved administering word association tests to patients and healthy volunteers. I would read a list of words and measure how long it took each person to respond with the first word that came to mind. This simple technique revealed something extraordinary about the human psyche. Certain words consistently caused delays, physical reactions, and unusual responses that indicated the presence of autonomous psychological complexes. When a patient heard the word mother and suddenly became agitated, sweating, and unable to respond for several seconds, I knew I had touched upon a complexer cluster of emotionally charged ideas and memories that operated independently of conscious control. These complexes functioned like separate personalities within the psyche, each with its own agenda, emotions, and behavioral patterns. I discovered that we all carry multiple complexes, psychological fragments that can momentarily take over consciousness and direct our behavior in ways that surprise even ourselves. You might have a perfectionist complex that drives you to work obsessively, a victim complex that interprets neutral events as personal attacks, or an abandonment complex that sabotages intimate relationships out of fear of being left alone. The mother complex, which I studied extensively, illustrates how these autonomous fragments operate. A person with a negative mother complex might find themselves unable to receive nurturing from others, constantly critical of feminine qualities in themselves and others, or perpetually seeking the perfect maternal figure to heal old wounds. The complex operates like a lens that filters all experiences through the emotional charge of the original relationship with the mother. Complexes form when psychological material becomes split off from consciousness, usually due to trauma, overwhelming emotion, or experiences that cannot be integrated into our conscious understanding of ourselves. A child who experiences severe criticism might develop a shame complex that continues to operate decades later, causing them to feel inadequate even in situations where they are clearly competent and valued. What makes complexes particularly challenging is their autonomous nature. They seem to have a life of their own, appearing suddenly to hijack consciousness and create behavior that our rational mind would never choose. You might find yourself reacting with rage to a minor slight, falling into deep depression over a small setback, or becoming paralyzed with anxiety in situations that pose no real threat. In these moments, a complex has temporarily taken control. I learned to recognize the signs of complex activation in myself and my patients. Sudden emotional reactions that seem disproportionate to the triggering event, repetitive thought patterns that resist rational intervention, physical symptoms that appear without medical cause, and behavior patterns that repeat, despite conscious efforts to change them all, indicate the presence of active complexes. Rather than viewing complexes as pathological symptoms to be eliminated. I came to understand them as psychological material seeking integration and healing. Each complex contains not only wounded or undeveloped aspects of the personality, but also potential energy and capabilities that could enhance consciousness if properly integrated. The process of working with complexes involves first recognizing their presence and patterns of activation. When you notice yourself having an intense reaction, you can pause and ask, is this response proportionate to what's actually happening right now? Or am I being triggered by something from my past? This moment of conscious awareness begins to separate your observing ego from the complex's emotional charge. Active imagination proved particularly useful for complex work. I would encourage patients to dialogue with their complexes as if they were separate beings, asking what they needed, what they were trying to protect, and how they could be integrated more consciously into the personality. Often, complexes that seemed purely destructive revealed protective functions that had served important purposes at earlier stages of development. The goal is not to eliminate complexes, but to develop a conscious relationship with them. When you understand the emotional logic of your complexes and can recognize when they are becoming activated, you gain the ability to choose how to respond, rather than being unconsciously driven by their patterns. One afternoon, while working with a particularly intellectualized patient who approached every psychological insight as a mere theory to be analyzed, she was describing a dream about a golden scarab beetle. At that precise moment, I heard a tapping at the window behind me. When I opened it, a scarabid beetle, the closest thing to a golden scarab that existed in our Swiss climate, flew into the room. The timing was so perfect, so meaningful, that it broke through my patient's rigid, rational defenses and opened her to a deeper level of psychological understanding. This incident led me to develop the concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences, that suggest a connection between inner psychological states and outer events that cannot be explained by cause and effect. Unlike the mechanistic view of reality that dominates scientific thinking, synchronicity points toward an underlying order that connects mind and matter through meaning rather than causation. Throughout my life, I experienced countless synchronicities that seemed to offer guidance, confirmation, or warning about psychological and life developments. When I was struggling with a particular theoretical problem, relevant books would appear in unexpected places. When I needed to make important decisions, dreams would be followed by external events that provided clarity about the right direction. When patients were ready for breakthrough insights, their sessions would be accompanied by meaningful coincidences that reinforced the psychological work. I came to understand synchronicity as evidence that the psyche extends beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness, connecting us to a larger pattern of meaning that includes both psychological and physical reality. The ancient Chinese understood this principle through the I Ching, which assumes that the moment of consulting the oracle carries meaningful information about the psychological and practical situation of the questioner. Synchronicities tend to occur most frequently during periods of psychological transition, times when the conscious attitude is changing, and new possibilities are trying to emerge. When you are rigid in your thinking and behavior, synchronicities may be rare, but when you are open to growth and willing to pay attention to the deeper patterns of your experience, meaningful coincidences begin to appear with surprising regularity. The key to working with synchronicity is developing what I call a symbolic attitude, the ability to perceive meaning and pattern rather than seeking only literal, causal explanations. When something unexpected happens, instead of immediately dismissing it as random chance, you can ask, what might this event be reflecting about my current psychological situation? How does this connect to what I'm struggling with or trying to understand? I observed that synchronicities often carry a numinous quality, a sense of significance that feels almost sacred. They tend to occur when conscious and unconscious processes are aligned, when you are living authentically and paying attention to your deeper psychological development. They seem to serve as confirmations that you are on the right path, or warnings that you are moving away from your authentic direction. Working with synchronicity requires balancing openness to meaning with discrimination about which coincidences are genuinely significant. Not every unexpected event carries psychological meaning, and a tendency to see synchronicity everywhere can become a form of magical thinking that avoids practical responsibility. The test of a genuine synchronicity is usually its emotional impact and its relevance to your current psychological development. I found that keeping a journal of synchronistic experiences helped me recognize patterns and understand how these meaningful coincidences related to my psychological growth. Over time, I began to see that synchronicities often preceded important insights or life changes, as if the unconscious was using external events to prepare consciousness for new developments. Synchronicity suggests that we live in a universe where meaning and pattern operate alongside cause and effect, where psychological development and external events are connected through an underlying order that science has not yet learned to measure, but that consciousness can learn to recognize and work with creatively. During my most intensive period of psychological exploration, I began drawing circular images that seemed to emerge spontaneously from my unconscious. These mandalas, as I came to call them using the Sanskrit word for circle, appeared in my artwork and dreams with remarkable consistency. Each one was different, yet all shared the same basic structure, circle with a center, often containing 4 or 8 divisions, sometimes populated with symbolic figures or geometric patterns. I gradually understood these mandala images as representations of the self, not the ego or conscious personality, but the total psyche seeking wholeness and integration. The circular form suggested completion, while the centered structure indicated psychological organization around something deeper than ego consciousness. These images were arising from what I came to understand as the individuation process, the psyche's drive towards psychological wholeness and authentic self-realization. Individuation is perhaps the most important concept I developed, representing the central task of human psychological development. Unlike the adaptation required in the first half of life, developing ego strength, establishing social roles, achieving worldly success, individuation involves discovering and expressing your unique psychological configuration, integrating unconscious contents, and becoming the person you are meant to be rather than who others expect you to be. My own individuation crisis began in my late 30s, when external success could no longer mask a growing sense of emptiness and disconnection from my authentic nature. Despite my professional achievements and social recognition, I felt as though I was living someone else's life, following a script written by family expectations and cultural norms, rather than my own inner guidance. The process began with a breakdown of my previous psychological organization, everything I had built my identity upon, my rational approach to life, my professional success, my careful control of emotional expression began to crumble. I was flooded with fantasies, visions, and emotional experiences that challenged every assumption I had made about myself and reality. This disintegration was terrifying but necessary. Individuation requires the dissolution of false or incomplete identities to make room for a more authentic and comprehensive sense of self. The ego that had served me well in establishing my career and social position was too narrow to contain the fullness of my psychological reality. The individuation process follows recognizable stages, though each person's journey is unique. First comes the encounter with the shadow, acknowledging and integrating the rejected aspects of personality. Then the dissolution of persona identification, recognizing that social roles are not your true identity. Next comes the integration of anima, or animus developing the contrasexual aspects of your nature. Finally, there is the gradual emergence of the self, new center of personality that encompasses both conscious and unconscious contents. Each stage involves both loss and gain. When I began to acknowledge my shadow, I had to give up my image of myself as purely rational and good. When I stopped identifying completely with my professional persona, I lost some of the security that came from clearly defined social roles. When I began to integrate my anima, I had to question masculine stereotypes about emotion and intuition. But each loss opens space for greater psychological capacity and authenticity. The self that emerges through individuation is not the ego expanded, but something qualitatively differenter, center of personality that includes but transcends ego. Consciousness. In my mandala drawings, I often depicted this self as a wise figure, a divine child, or a geometric pattern that suggested both human and transpersonal dimensions. The self connects individual personality to archetypal patterns and universal human experiences. Individuation is not a selfish process, despite superficial appearances. When you become who you truly are, rather than conforming to external expectations, you actually become more capable of genuine service and authentic relationship. The individuated person can give from fullness rather than need, love from choice rather than compulsion, and act from inner conviction rather than social pressure. The process requires tremendous courage because it involves standing alone with your own psychological reality, even when it conflicts with collective values and expectations. There were periods in my individuation when I felt completely isolated, as if I were the only person in the world experiencing certain psychological truths. Yet this aloneness was necessary to discover what belonged authentically to me, rather than what I had absorbed from others. Individuation also demands discrimination, the ability to distinguish between genuine psychological development and ego inflation. The person undergoing individuation must constantly ask, is this growth serving my authentic development, or am I simply aggrandizing my ego? The self has a quality of humility and service that the inflated ego lacks. I came to understand that individuation is both a psychological and a spiritual process. It connects the individual to something larger than personal concerns, while simultaneously honoring the unique contribution that each person is meant to make. The individuated person becomes a bridge between the collective and the divine, serving both human community and transpersonal values. The mandala images that emerged during my individuation showed me that wholeness is not a static achievement, but a dynamic process of creative tension between opposing forces. The self maintains unity while containing multiplicity, provides stability while allowing for growth, and offers guidance while respecting individual freedom. My work with patients and my observations of human behavior led me to develop a systematic understanding of psychological types, fundamental differences in how people orient themselves toward the world and process information. This typology emerged from my recognition that what appeared to be pathological behavior in some individuals was actually the natural expression of a different psychological type, operating in an environment that didn't support their natural functioning. I identified two basic attitudes toward life: extroversion and introversion. The extrovert directs energy and attention primarily toward the outer world of people, events, and external stimulation. They tend to be energized by social interaction, think out loud, and prefer breadth of experience over depth. The introvert directs energy and attention primarily toward their inner world of thoughts, feelings, and reflection. They tend to be energized by solitude, think before speaking, and prefer depth of experience over breadth. Neither attitude is superior to the other, though our culture often favors extroversion while viewing introversion as something to be overcome. My own psychological type is primarily introverted, which meant that I often felt misunderstood in social and professional contexts that valued extroverted qualities like quick verbal responses, social ease, and comfort with external stimulation. Beyond these basic attitudes, I discovered for psychological functions that describe how people gather information and make decisions. The thinking function evaluates information logically, seeking objective truth and systematic understanding. The feeling function evaluates information based on personal and interpersonal values, seeking harmony and authentic meaning. The sensation function gathers information through the five senses, focusing on concrete facts and present realities. The intuition function gathers information through pattern recognition and future possibilities, focusing on potential meanings and creative connections. Each person has access to all four functions, but typically develops one as their dominant or superior function, while its opposite remains largely unconscious and undeveloped. This creates what I call the inferior function, the psychological function that operates with less consciousness and control, often causing problems but also providing access to creative and compensatory energy. My own dominant function is thinking, which meant that I naturally approached problems through logical analysis and systematic reasoning. However, this overdevelopment of thinking created difficulties in my personal relationships, where feeling function skills like empathy, interpersonal sensitivity, and value-based decision-making were essential. My inferior feeling function would sometimes erupt inappropriately, causing emotional reactions that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Understanding psychological types revolutionized how I worked with patients and understood interpersonal conflict. A thinking type trying to help a feeling type by offering logical solutions might actually create more distress by ignoring the emotional and valued dimensions of the problem. An intuitive type, frustrated with a sensation type's focus on practical details, might miss the wisdom of grounding visionary ideas in concrete reality. Type differences also explain many marital and family conflicts. Partners often choose each other partly because they represent undeveloped aspects of their own personality. The thinking type attracted to the feeling type's emotional warmth. The sensation type fascinated by the intuitive type's creative vision. But these same differences can become sources of misunderstanding and frustration when each person expects the other to function according to their own psychological preferences. The goal of psychological development is not to change your basic type, but to develop greater consciousness and skill in your less preferred functions. This creates psychological balance and reduces the tendency to project onto others the qualities you haven't developed in yourself. When I began to consciously develop my feeling function, I became more effective in relationships while maintaining my natural analytical strengths. Type development also involves recognizing when to use different functions appropriately. In professional contexts requiring objective analysis, thinking function serves well. In interpersonal situations requiring sensitivity and harmony, feeling function becomes essential. In situations requiring attention to practical details, sensation function provides necessary grounding. In situations requiring creative solutions and future planning, intuitive function offers visionary perspective. Understanding your psychological type provides a framework for self-acceptance while also indicating areas for potential growth and development. Throughout my life, I collected religious symbols, artifacts, and imagery from cultures around the world. My study was filled with crosses, mandalas, statues of Buddha, Hindu deities, and alchemical texts, not as a believer in any particular religion, but as a student of the human psyche's need for transcendent meaning and connection to something larger than individual existence. My personal relationship with religion was complex and often troubled. Raised in a family of pastors, I was surrounded by Christian theology from birth, yet I found myself unable to accept many traditional religious teachings on purely faith-based grounds. My father's struggle with doubt and my mother's mystical experiences taught me that religion involved profound psychological dimensions that went far beyond intellectual belief or social conformity. I came to understand religious symbols and practices as expressions of archetypal patterns within the collective unconscious: the cross, the mandala, the divine child, the wise old man, the great mother. These religious images appear in cultures worldwide because they represent universal human psychological experiences. They provide symbolic containers for the deepest questions and needs of human existence: the search for meaning, the experience of suffering, the hope for transformation, the connection to something eternal. The danger in our modern era is not that people believe too strongly in religion, but that they have lost connection to the symbolic and mythological dimensions of human experience. When religious symbols are reduced to literal beliefs or historical facts, they lose their psychological power to orient consciousness toward transcendent values and experiences. A purely rational, scientific worldview, while valuable for understanding the material world, cannot address the human need for meaning, purpose, and connection to the sacred. I observed that patients who had completely abandoned religious or spiritual frameworks often suffered from what I called spiritual neurosis, a sense of emptiness and meaninglessness that could not be cured through psychological analysis alone. The psyche seems to require connection to transpersonal values and experiences, whether these are found through traditional religion, spiritual practice, art, nature, or service to others. My studies of various religious traditions revealed remarkable similarities in their understanding of psychological transformation: the Christian process of death and resurrection, the Buddhist path of enlightenment, the alchemical work of transformation. All describe similar patterns of psychological development, involving the dissolution of ego identification and the emergence of a transpersonal center of identity. However, I also recognized the shadow side of religious experience. When religion becomes rigid dogma that suppresses individual psychological development, it serves neurosis rather than wholeness. When religious institutions use guilt, fear, and conformity to control behavior rather than supporting authentic spiritual growth, they become obstacles to individuation rather than aids to psychological development. The healthy relationship to religion involves what I call a symbolic attitude, the ability to appreciate religious imagery and practices for their psychological wisdom while maintaining critical thinking about literal claims and institutional authority. This allows you to benefit from the accumulated spiritual wisdom of humanity while taking responsibility for your own psychological and spiritual development. I found that many of the most profound religious symbols could be understood as maps of psychological development: the journey of the hero, the path of the mystic, the stages of spiritual initiation. These traditional frameworks provide guidance for the individuation process, offering time-tested wisdom about the challenges and opportunities of psychological growth. In my later years, I developed an appreciation for the collective function of religion in providing shared symbols and values that bind communities together around transcendent purposes. While individual psychological development remains essential, humans are also collective beings who need shared meaning and common values to create healthy societies and cultures. In my library at Kuznakt, I accumulated one of the world's largest collections of alchemical texts, medieval manuscripts filled with strange symbols, cryptic formulas, and bizarre experimental procedures that seemed to make no scientific sense. Most scholars dismissed these works as primitive chemistry or fraudulent attempts to create gold from base metals. But as I studied these texts more deeply, I realized They contained sophisticated psychological wisdom disguised in the language of chemical transformation that the alchemists spoke of transforming lead into gold. But I came to understand that they were actually describing the psychological process of transforming unconscious, undifferentiated psychic material into conscious wisdom and integrated personality. Their laboratory work was a projection of inner psychological processes onto chemical substances and procedures. The alchemical work began with what they called the prima materia, the initial chaotic substance that contained all possibilities, but lacked conscious organization. This corresponds to the unconscious psyche in its raw, unintegrated state, containing both destructive and creative potentials that must be carefully worked with to produce psychological gold, the integrated, individuated personality. I traced the alchemical stages through my own psychological development and that of my patients. The nigredo or blackening phase corresponds to the encounter with the shadow and the dissolution of ego identifications. This is the darkest and most difficult stage, where everything you thought you knew about yourself appears to disintegrate. Many people become stuck in this phase, overwhelmed by the chaos and darkness they discover within themselves. The albedo or whitening phase represents the emergence of new consciousness and the beginning of integration. Light begins to dawn on the psychological work, and the person starts to understand the meaning of their suffering and confusion. This corresponds to the development of the observing ego that can witness psychological processes without being completely identified with them. The rubedo or reddening phase represents the final integration and the emergence of the philosophical gold, the self, as the new center of personality. This is not a static achievement, but an ongoing process of creative relationship between conscious and unconscious, individual and collective, human and divine dimensions of experience. The alchemists emphasized that the work required both solve et coagulate, solve and coagulate. Psychological development involves repeatedly dissolving old forms of consciousness and allowing new forms to crystallize. This process cannot be rushed or controlled through willpower alone, but requires patience, attention, and respect for the natural timing of psychological transformation. I found particular meaning in the alchemical emphasis on the opus contra naturam, the work against nature. Psychological individuation requires going against natural collective tendencies toward conformity and unconsciousness. It demands the courage to be different, to think independently, and to follow inner guidance even when it conflicts with social expectations and cultural norms. The alchemical texts also revealed the importance of the vessel, the container within which transformation takes place. In psychological terms, this represents the therapeutic relationship, the meditative practice, the creative work, or the life circumstances that provide safe space for psychological material to be worked with consciously, without an adequate vessel. Psychological contents remain chaotic and potentially destructive. My study of alchemy showed me that transformation is not a linear process, but involves cycles of death and rebirth, dissolution and reconstruction, loss and recovery. The alchemists understood that gold could not be created without first destroying the original form of the material, just as psychological wholeness cannot be achieved without releasing attachment to partial identities and limited self-concepts. The ultimate goal of the alchemical work was the creation of the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone that could transmute any substance into gold. Psychologically, this represents the development of an attitude or perspective that can find meaning and value in any life experience, transforming even suffering and failure into wisdom and compassion. The alchemical tradition provided me with a sophisticated map of psychological transformation that complemented and enriched my understanding of individuation, offering practical guidance for the long work of becoming conscious and whole. My marriage to Emma taught me more about the psychology of relationships than years of clinical work with patients. We were drawn together initially by powerful projections, saw in her the cultivated, socially graceful, feminine wisdom that I lacked, while she was attracted to my intellectual intensity and psychological insight. These projections served an important function in bringing us together, but they also created the fundamental challenges that we had to work through over decades of marriage. In the early years, I expected Emma to carry my undeveloped feeling, function, to provide emotional warmth and interpersonal sensitivity, while I focused on intellectual and professional pursuits. She, in turn, projected onto me her undeveloped thinking function, expecting me to handle all analytical decisions and theoretical understanding. This division of psychological labor worked temporarily, but eventually created resentment and limitation for both of us. I began to understand projection as one of the most fundamental psychological mechanisms affecting all human relationships. We unconsciously attribute to others the qualities, both positive and negative, that we haven't recognized or developed in ourselves. The person who irritates you most probably carries a projection of your own shadow material. The person you idealize most likely represents projected potentials that you haven't claimed as your own. Romantic love is often largely projection. We fall in love with our own unrealized possibilities, reflected in another person. The intensity of romantic attraction frequently correlates with the strength of the projection rather than genuine knowledge of the other person's actual character and values. This is why romantic relationships often involve periods of disillusionment when the projections fade, and we begin to see the actual person rather than our psychological creation. My relationship with Emma evolved as we both began to withdraw projections and develop the qualities we had attributed to each other. I had to learn to access my own emotional intelligence and interpersonal sensitivity. Rather than relying on her to provide these functions, she had to develop her analytical thinking and intellectual independence rather than deferring to my judgment in these areas. This process of projection, withdrawal, is often painful because it requires giving up the fantasy of completion through relationship. When you stop projecting your undeveloped masculinity onto your partner, you can no longer expect him to provide strength, decisiveness, and direction for both of you. When you stop projecting your undeveloped femininity onto your partner, you can no longer expect her to provide emotional warmth, intuitive wisdom, and relational harmony for the couple. However, relationships become far more authentic and sustainable when they are based on genuine appreciation rather than psychological need. When you develop your own capacity for the qualities you once sought exclusively in others, you can enjoy these qualities in your partner without desperately needing them to complete you. Love becomes a choice made from fullness rather than a compulsion driven by emptiness. I learned to recognize the signs of active projection in my relationships. When my emotional reaction to someone seemed disproportionate to their actual behavior, I knew I was probably encountering my own projected material. When I found myself either idealizing or demonizing someone, projection was likely involved. When I felt that another person should behave differently to meet my needs, I was often trying to control them rather than taking responsibility for my own. Psychological development. The work of relationship involves ongoing attention to projection dynamics. Instead of immediately blaming your partner for disappointing or frustrating you, you can ask, what part of myself am I trying to make them responsible for? What quality do I need to develop rather than demanding it from them? This doesn't mean that all relationship problems are projection, but many conflicts involve projection elements that, when recognized and withdrawn, dramatically improve the relationship. Parent-child relationships are particularly prone to projection, as parents often try to live vicariously through their children's achievements or force children to carry unlived aspects of their own potential. Children, in turn, may project authority and wisdom onto parents long after they've become capable of independent judgment. Healthy relationships require recognizing and respecting the separate psychological reality of each person. As I entered my 60s and 70s, I became increasingly aware that the psychological tasks of later life are fundamentally different from those of youth and middle age. The values and goals that had driven me through the first half of life, achievement, social recognition, building a reputation in psychology, gradually lost their compelling power and were replaced by different concerns: meaning, legacy, spiritual development, and connection to transpersonal values. I observed this transition not only in myself, but in many of my older patients, who came to me struggling with what seemed like depression or anxiety but was actually a spiritual crisis. They had achieved what they thought they wanted: successful careers, financial security, raised families, yet felt empty and purposeless. The external achievements that had provided motivation and satisfaction in earlier decades no longer offered psychological nourishment. The first half of life is naturally focused on adaptation to external reality, developing ego strength, acquiring skills, establishing social roles, building relationships, accumulating resources. These tasks require extravagant energy directed toward conquering and adapting to the outer world. The psychological attitude that serves this phase emphasizes growth, expansion, and forward movement. But the second half of life calls for a different orientation, one that turns inward toward questions of meaning, wisdom, and spiritual development. The achievements and accumulations of the first half of life become less important than understanding what they mean, what values they serve, and what legacy they represent. This phase requires developing what I call a transcendent function, the ability to find meaning that goes beyond personal gain and connects individual life to larger purposes. Many people resist this transition, trying to maintain the attitudes and goals of youth well into their later years. I've seen men in their 70s still frantically pursuing business success as if their worth depended entirely on external achievement. I've known women in their 60s who remained focused primarily on their physical appearance and social status, avoiding the deeper questions of meaning and purpose that were trying to emerge. This resistance to the natural development of the second half of life often leads to what I call a false young attitude, an attempt to maintain the energy and orientation of youth through external means while ignoring the call toward inner development. Such resistance typically results in increasing rigidity, depression, and a sense that life is passing by without genuine fulfillment. The healthy transition to the second half of life involves accepting limitations while discovering new sources of meaning and vitality. Physical energy may decline, but psychological wisdom can increase. Social roles may diminish, but spiritual understanding can deepen. External achievements may lose their luster, but inner development can provide lasting satisfaction. I found this transition particularly challenging because my professional identity had been so central to my sense of self. Learning to value my inner development and personal wisdom as much as my published works and professional recognition required a fundamental shift in how I understood success and significance. The second half of life also brings increased awareness of mortality, which paradoxically can lead to greater appreciation of life and more conscious choices about how to spend remaining time. When you truly accept that your days are numbered, you become more selective about activities and relationships that genuinely matter versus those that merely fill time or maintain social appearances. This phase of life often involves what I call the return to archetypal concerns, questions about the meaning of suffering, the nature of death, the possibility of transcendence, the legacy of individual life. These are not intellectual puzzles. but lived experiences that require spiritual and philosophical development rather than practical problem-solving. The wisdom of the second half of life cannot be achieved through effort and willpower alone, but requires a certain receptivity and acceptance of life's deeper mysteries. It involves learning to be rather than constantly doing, to receive wisdom rather than only creating achievements, to serve transpersonal values rather than purely personal goals. I discovered that the second half of life often brings what I call the religious problem, not necessarily involvement with organized religion, but the emergence of questions about ultimate meaning, purpose, and connection to something greater than individual existence. Patients who had never been particularly spiritual would suddenly find themselves preoccupied with questions about death, the meaning of suffering, and the possibility of transcendence. This spiritual dimension of later life development requires different therapeutic approaches than the practical problem-solving that often suffices for younger patients. The successful businessman struggling with emptiness, despite material achievement, cannot be helped by strategies for greater success. The devoted mother feeling lost when her children leave home needs guidance about identity and purpose beyond social roles. My own transition into the second half of life involved a gradual shift from seeking external validation to trusting internal wisdom. The opinions of colleagues and critics became less important than alignment with my authentic insights and values. This change was both liberating and isolating. Liberating because it freed me from social pressures that had constrained my thinking. Isolating because it meant accepting responsibility for psychological and spiritual development that no external authority could provide. The second half of life also brings increased awareness of the shadow side of previous achievements and identities. Success that once felt purely positive reveals its cost, relationships neglected for career advancement, authentic impulses suppressed for social acceptance, creative potentials sacrificed for security. This recognition can be painful, but also opens possibilities for integration and renewal that aren't available earlier in life. I observed that people who navigate the transition to the second half of life most successfully are those who can find ways to mentor and contribute to the development of younger generations. This generative impulse serves both individual and collective needs, providing older people with meaningful purpose, while ensuring that accumulated wisdom is transmitted to those who can use it. The confrontation with mortality that intensifies in the second half of life need not lead to despair, but can catalyze a deepening appreciation for the preciousness and mystery of existence. When you truly accept that your time is limited, you naturally become more discriminating about how to spend your remaining years, more focused on what genuinely matters, and more aware of the legacy you want to leave. This phase of life often involves what I call a return to the eternal child, not regression to immaturity, but recovery of the wonder, spontaneity, and openness to mystery that characterized childhood before it was overlaid with adult responsibilities and social expectations. The integrated older person combines mature wisdom with childlike curiosity, practical experience with spiritual openness. In my final decades, I spent considerable effort trying to synthesize all my psychological discoveries into a coherent understanding of human development and the nature of consciousness. Yet the more I attempted to create systematic theories, the more I recognized that the deepest truths about human psychology cannot be reduced to simple formulas or linear processes. Life's essential nature is paradoxical, and psychological maturity involves learning to live comfortably with contradiction and uncertainty. I came to understand that integration is not the same as resolution. The goal of psychological development is not to eliminate conflict and tension, but to develop the capacity to hold opposing forces in creative relationship. The shadow is never completely integrated, but remains a lifelong partner, requiring ongoing attention. The persona is never completely dissolved, but continues to serve necessary social functions. The anima, or animus, is never fully developed, but continues to mediate between consciousness and the unconscious throughout life. This recognition led me to appreciate what I call the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to maintain creative tension between opposing elements, rather than prematurely resolving them into false syntheses. When you can hold both your strength and your vulnerability, your wisdom and your ignorance, your love and your anger, you develop psychological flexibility that allows for authentic response to life's changing demands. I learned this lesson painfully through my own attempts to become a consistently wise and integrated person. There were periods when I thought I had achieved psychological wholeness, only to discover new areas of unconsciousness, or to find myself reacting in ways that contradicted my self-understanding. These humbling experiences taught me that integration is a process rather than an achievement, a way of being rather than a state to be attained. The paradoxical nature of psychological truth became evident in my work with patients and in my own self-analysis. Every psychological principle I discovered seemed to contain its opposite. Consciousness is essential for psychological development, yet too much consciousness can lead to obsessive self-analysis that blocks spontaneous living. Accepting yourself is crucial for mental health, yet accepting everything about yourself can lead to complacency that prevents necessary growth. I found that the most profound psychological insights often emerged from embracing rather than solving these paradoxes. When patients could accept both their need for relationship and their need for independence, they often discovered new ways of being intimate that honored both needs. When they could acknowledge both their desire for security and their need for adventure, they found creative approaches to living that satisfied both longings. This paradoxical thinking extended to my understanding of mental health itself. I realized that perfect psychological adjustment is neither possible nor desirable. Some degree of tension, conflict, and uncertainty seems necessary for psychological vitality and continued growth. The person who has resolved all inner conflicts may have achieved a kind of psychological death rather than genuine integration. My late writings reflected this acceptance of paradox and uncertainty. Rather than offering definitive answers about human psychology, I increasingly focused on asking better questions and developing attitudes that could work creatively with the mysteries of consciousness. I learned to value psychological wisdom that could tolerate ambiguity rather than demanding false certainty. The practice of living with paradox requires developing what I call negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty and doubt, without irritably reaching after fact and reason. This doesn't mean abandoning rational thought, but expanding beyond purely logical approaches to include intuitive, symbolic, and experiential ways of knowing. Integration, I discovered, involves becoming comfortable with being a work in progress, rather than striving for a finished product. It means accepting that you will continue to discover new aspects of yourself, encounter unexpected challenges, and need to revise your self-understanding throughout life. This ongoing openness to self-discovery keeps the personality flexible and alive rather than rigid and defensive. The integrated person is not free from psychological problems, but has developed creative ways of working with difficulties as they arise. They have learned to dance with their neuroses, rather than being paralyzed by them, to use their symptoms as teachers, rather than seeing them only as obstacles. This mature relationship with psychological suffering represents one of the most important developments of later life. Earlier in my career, I approached psychological symptoms primarily as problems to be solved or eliminated, but experience taught me that symptoms often carry important information about unmet psychological needs or blocked development. The anxiety that seems purely troublesome may be signaling the need for new growth. The depression that feels like meaningless suffering may be preparing the ground for psychological renewal. I learned to approach my own psychological difficulties with curiosity rather than immediate rejection, asking what they might be trying to teach me rather than simply how to make them go away. This attitude doesn't romanticize suffering or suggest that all psychological pain serves positive purposes, but it acknowledges that consciousness often grows through engaging with difficulty rather than avoiding it. The integration of polarities extends beyond individual psychology to collective and cultural dimensions. I came to understand that healthy societies, like healthy individuals, must find ways to honor both conservative and progressive impulses, both individual freedom and collective responsibility, both rational analysis and intuitive wisdom. Societies that become too one-sided in any direction create shadow problems that eventually demand compensation. My late work increasingly focused on what I call the transcendent function, the psychological capacity that emerges when opposing forces are held in creative tension rather than resolved through elimination of one side. This function allows for responses that transcend the limitations of either or thinking, finding third options that honor the legitimate needs represented by conflicting positions. The development of the transcendent function requires what I learned to call psychological courage the willingness to remain present with uncertainty, contradiction, and complexity without rushing toward premature solutions. This courage develops through repeated experiences of working with paradox and discovering that creative possibilities often emerge from situations that initially seem impossible to resolve. I found that the most profound psychological insights arise not from theoretical analysis, but from lived experience of psychological tensions and their creative resolution. The patient who could hold both love and anger toward a parent without having to choose between them often discovered new ways of relating that honored both feelings. The individual who could accept both their strength and vulnerability found authentic power that neither pure dominance nor pure submission could provide. This integration work continues throughout life, as new challenges and developmental stages present fresh opportunities for growth and synthesis. The person who has successfully integrated the challenges of midlife may find entirely new polarities emerging in later years, the tension between holding on and letting go, between sharing wisdom and respecting others need to learn through their own experience, between accepting mortality and continuing to invest in life. As I near the end of this long conversation about the depths of human consciousness, I want to leave you with practical guidance for beginning your own journey towards psychological wholeness. The insights I've shared are not mere intellectual concepts, but living truths that must be experienced and applied to transform your relationship with yourself and your life. Throughout my years of practice, I wrote countless letters to patients and colleagues seeking guidance for their psychological development. These letters, now preserved in archives, contain the most practical advice I can offer for anyone beginning the work of individuation and self-understanding. Start with honest self-observation. Pay attention to your automatic reactions, your repetitive patterns, your emotional triggers. Notice when you feel most authentic and when you feel like you're performing a role. Observe which situations energize you and which drain your vitality. This foundation of self-awareness provides the raw material for all psychological work. Keep a journal of your dreams, even if you don't understand their meaning initially. Dreams are letters from your unconscious, offering guidance and compensation for the one-sided attitudes of consciousness. Over time, patterns will emerge that illuminate your psychological development and point toward needed growth. Don't worry about perfect interpretational tension, and respect for dream material is more important than analytical precision. Create regular time for solitude and reflection. The constant stimulation of modern life makes it difficult to hear the quieter voices of the unconscious. Whether through meditation, walking in nature, creative expression, or simply sitting quietly, you need protected time when you're not performing for others or consuming external input. In this stillness, deeper aspects of yourself can emerge. Notice your projections, particularly in your closest relationships. When you find yourself strongly attracted to or irritated by someone, ask what qualities they might be carrying for you. What do you admire in others that you haven't developed in yourself? What do you criticize in others that you refuse to acknowledge in your own personality? Withdrawing projections is one of the most practical ways to reclaim disowned parts of yourself. Pay attention to your psychological type and respect your natural way of functioning while also developing less preferred functions. If you're naturally introverted, honor your need for solitude and depth while also developing social skills and comfort with external engagement. If you're primarily a thinking type, value your analytical abilities while also developing emotional intelligence and sensitivity to values. Work with your shadow material through honest acknowledgement of your less admirable qualities. Notice what you judge most harshly in others. These judgments often point toward shadow projections. Ask yourself, how am I capable of the behavior I criticize? When have I acted in similar ways? This is not about guilt, but about reclaiming psychological energy that gets trapped in unconscious shadow material. Find meaningful work or creative expression that connects you to something larger than personal concerns. Individuation is not self-centered, but serves both individual development and collective human welfare. Whether through professional work, artistic creation, service to others, or spiritual practice, you need ways of contributing to life that utilize your unique gifts and abilities. Develop tolerance for uncertainty and psychological complexity. Resist the modern tendency to seek quick fixes or simple answers for psychological questions. Your personality is more complex and mysterious than you imagine, and this complexity is a source of richness rather than a problem to be solved. Learn to appreciate the ongoing nature of psychological development rather than seeking final states of achievement. Seek appropriate support when you encounter psychological material that feels overwhelming, or when you recognize patterns that seem beyond your ability to change alone. This might include therapy, spiritual direction, meaningful friendships, or participation in groups focused on personal growth. Individuation is ultimately an individual process, but it need not be a solitary one. As you embark on this journey toward greater consciousness and authenticity, remember that the goal is not perfection but wholeness, the integration of all aspects of your personality into a creative, flexible, and meaningful way of being. The work is lifelong, sometimes difficult, but ultimately the most worthwhile endeavor you can undertake. Your consciousness is both your individual inheritance and your contribution to the collective human effort to become more aware, more conscious, more fully human. In doing your own psychological work, you serve not only your personal development, but the evolution of consciousness itself. The chaos in your mind that brought you to seek understanding is not your enemy, but your invitation to discover the order that emerges when consciousness and unconscious work together in creative partnership. Trust the process, honor the mystery, and begin wherever you are. Remember that psychological development is not a linear progression toward perfection, but a spiral journey that revisits similar themes at deeper levels throughout life. The shadow work you do in your 30s will need to be renewed in your 50s with greater subtlety and wisdom. The relationship patterns you recognize in your 40s will continue to evolve and require attention in your 60s. This is not failure, but the natural rhythm of psychological growth. Be patient with the pace of inner development. The unconscious operates according to its own timing, which rarely matches our conscious preferences for rapid change. Like the alchemists, who understood that transformation could not be rushed without destroying the process. Learn to work with the natural rhythms of psychological change rather than forcing outcomes through willpower alone. Cultivate what I call active receptivity, the capacity to remain open to input from the unconscious while maintaining conscious discrimination about how to respond to that input. Not every impulse from the unconscious should be acted upon, but all deserve attention and consideration. The key is developing the judgment to distinguish between destructive impulses that should be contained and creative impulses that deserve expression. Create ritual and ceremony in your life that honors psychological transitions and achievements. Mark the completion of important projects, the resolution of significant conflicts, the integration of new insights. These conscious acknowledgements help consolidate psychological gains and signal to the unconscious that you value the work of transformation. Build relationships with others who are committed to psychological development and authentic living. While individuation is ultimately an individual process, it benefits enormously from community with others who understand the challenges and rewards of inner work. Seek out friends, mentors, therapists, or groups that can provide support, challenge, and companionship on the journey toward wholeness. Learn to recognize the difference between problems that can be solved and mysteries that must be lived. Some psychological challenges yield to analysis, insight, and behavioral change. Others are existential givens that require acceptance, integration, and creative response rather than elimination. Developing wisdom means knowing which category your current challenge belongs to. Trust your own psychological authority while remaining open to learning from others. The insights I've shared are maps, not territories. They point toward psychological truths that you must discover and verify through your own experience. Use what serves your development and leave what doesn't resonate. Trusting your own inner guidance while remaining humble about the limitations of your current understanding. Finally, remember that the work of consciousness is both deeply personal and profoundly collective. As you become more aware, more integrated, more authentically yourself, you contribute to the evolution of human consciousness itself. Your individual journey toward wholeness serves not only your personal fulfillment, but the greater human project of becoming more conscious, more compassionate, and more fully alive to the mystery and meaning of existence.